Welcome to the Atheist in Recovery podcast, where we talk about finding hope in recovery. And now your host, Dr. Adina Silvestri.
Bonjour, guys, and welcome to episode 41 of the Atheists in Recovery podcast. And today we are talking all about recovery-related online technology. We've all had to go online. As I record this, we are still in the midst of COVID-19 and are sheltering in place, and all of our recovery resources have moved online. And so how do we access this technology in a way that is going to be helpful for us? And that is what I'm talking about with my guest, Dr. Brandon Bergman, today. We talk about the benefits and the challenges of using online technology. And that could be anything from smart apps, recovery-related smart apps, to, online recovery groups like AA and Smart Recovery, in the rooms, things like that. And at the very end, he talks about how we could get the most out of these platforms. And he gives some really great tips on even just things like more active involvement on these platforms like AA and Smart Recovery and in the rooms and LifeRing. And how does that work for us? And what do we need to be mindful of to make sure that we're getting the most for our recovery? We're getting the most benefit for our recovery. Okay, guys, on to our guest. Dr. Brandon Bergman is an associate director and research scientist at the Massachusetts General Hospital Recovery Research Institute, an assistant professor of psychology at Harvard Medical School, and a licensed clinical psychologist. His original research, funded by the NIH and IAAA, examines online technology-based recovery communities, as well as science, as well as substance-related risks and benefits of general interest social network site participation, with a special focus on the life stage of emerging adults. Okay, guys, here we go. Dr. Brandon Bergman, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
So I want to start this conversation by inquiring about your spiritual background from childhood.
Sure. So even though certainly, obviously, religion and spirituality are two very different constructs, but I grew up and identify as Jewish. I also identify as a sort of ethnic, I guess, cultural ethnic Jew, far more so than a religious. I have never found myself to be religious. And I think in terms of spirituality, that's something that's always been interesting to me and something that I work on in ways of thinking about kind of how relationships in my life can feel like they're bigger in some ways than the material. But I would say for the most part, I have always leaned towards the intellectual, the empirical, and the scientific versus the sort of spiritual. But it is something that as I've gotten older, I have started to think a lot more about in my life.
Okay. Great. So I wanted to bring you on today to talk about your research, specifically on the recovery-related use of online technology.
Cool.
Yeah. So I'm wondering if you could just give like a brief overview of what R.O.O.T is for our listeners.
Sure. Yeah. Also, one of the things, just as a preface, one of the things that's like my biggest, this is for listeners too, anybody that ever reads like a scientific article, one of my biggest pet peeves is how liberal we are in science with the use of acronyms and initialisms that don't necessarily, and in part we do it to save space because like in scientific articles, right, like we only have a certain number of characters, and if you're going to say something over and over and over again, like for example, recovery-related use of online technology, to be able to say that over and over and over again in the paper. So you sort of create an acronym.
Mouthful.
Yeah. And then it ends up becoming a thing where people who are sort of familiar with the term, it can feel jargony. And so I don't necessarily expect people to use the term R.O.O.T unless they like it. I'm not like trying to start a movement of getting people to call recovery-related use of online technology R.O.O.T. So I try to stick to like using acronyms only that are like very commonly used if we're talking about therapy, psychotherapy, like CBT, for example, people know is cognitive behavioral therapy, or in the recovery world, people know AA is Alcoholics Anonymous. So if it's commonly used, I'll use it. Otherwise, I really try not to. But okay, so that's my initial preface there. And so with the R.O.O.T, recovery-related use of online technology, well, in this particular paper, we conducted this big nationally representative study called the National Recovery Study at the Recovery Research Institute. My mentor / senior colleague, John Kelly, was the principal investigator on it, and I was very, very involved in helping him develop it. And so we got a nationally representative sample. It's nationally representative along geographic and demographic lines. I could get into more detail there if you want. And we've got a sample of folks, a representative sample of U.S. adults who have, quote, resolved an alcohol or drug problem. And so the way we asked that question was, did you used to have a problem with alcohol or drugs, but no longer do? And it was so being included in the survey was based completely on their self-report of whether they had an alcohol or other drug problem and whether they have resolved that problem. And so in this particular study, we also asked them about how they used online technology, either to help address their substance use, right? Because they might have used online technologies, and I'll tell you about what some of those are, but it could have been to cut back on substance use, to quit substance use, or if they had already made the change in their substance use, whether it was abstinence or what have you, to strengthen their recovery, right? To improve their quality of life and the other parts of their recovery they're working on over and above substance use, right? So in this study, they told us if they had ever used a social network site, which is sort of fancier way of just saying social media. And I could tell you about what some of those different sites are, but whether they had ever used a social network site for those reasons. We also asked them if they had, so for folks who had ever attended recovery support meetings, mutual help meetings, right? So the most popular ones certainly are 12-step groups like AA, right? And NA, Narcotics Anonymous, and some other ones. But as you and your listeners know, there are certainly non-12-step mutual help organizations out there too, like Smart Recovery and LifeRing. And so we asked people, and then there are religious mutual help organizations, like explicitly religious mutual help organizations too, right? Like Celebrate Recovery. So if they had attended one of those, we asked them if they had ever attended an online meeting or an online group, right? That was based on that meeting. And then we also asked them if separately from either online meetings or social network sites, if they had ever used other kinds of digital or online technologies to, again, with that same stem, to either reduce their substance use, quit substances, or strengthen their recovery. And so we left that open-ended. It's sort of one of my slight regrets. And in a follow-up study, I'd like to get a little more information on it. But there, it could have been things like a smartphone application, right? So there's a litany of applications available on the App Store, whether somebody's got iOS, iPhone or an Android phone or something. There are many, many, many different ways people can go onto the App Store and find smartphone applications that sort of are intended to help them in many ways. And so in this context, it was any of those three things. It was either social network site use, having attended an online mutual help meeting, or some other digital service, which could have been smartphone applications or something like that. That was what recovery-related use of online technology was.
Thank you. Yeah. And so it would probably be a good idea now to go into the actual study a little bit.
Great.
Yeah. So the study, and I'll link to it in the show notes, but the title is Expanding the Reach of Alcohol and Other Drug Services, Prevalence and Correlates of U.S. Adult Engagement with Online Technology to Address Substance Problems. Yeah. It's a mouthful.
These scientific titles, we got to do something about that.
So where do you think would be best to start here?
One other distinction too to make, and this is something that's kind of near and dear to my heart, is trying to think through what the differences are ultimately in terms of what kinds of services are most useful and how people use them. In the ways that, for not everybody, but for many folks, recovery is a social process by nature in many ways. And when we look at what kinds of things explain how people do in recovery, social factors often pop up, no matter whether it's a study of non-professional services like AA or more professional substance use disorder treatments, right? Like different kinds of cognitive behavioral approaches. You see these social mechanisms show up everywhere as factors that explain why people do well. So for example, adaptive social network changes is a very robust kind of explanatory variable of why people do well, which essentially means in some ways it's like a no duh kind of thing, but that part of what is helpful to people is giving them opportunities to add people to their social networks that are either in recovery themselves or can support their recovery, and dropping people from their networks that don't support their recovery, right?
Yeah.
So this is all to say that recovery is fundamentally, and I think this is true if you talk to a wide range of kind of quote unquote experts on recovery. And when I say experts, I mean also people that are in recovery, right? People with lived experience, like various stakeholders. It's described as a fundamentally social process. And so recovery is happening and because social network sites, social media, the big tech, companies, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, right? That those are places where people are socializing. Yes, that it sort of skews a little bit young, but far less these days. And in the general population, you have 70% of people that are using a social network site. Almost everybody who's on a social network site has a Facebook account. And then, yes, when you get down into like sort of the young adult crowd, that number gets up to 90%. So I say that all to kind of just ground our conversation in this notion that like recovery is happening on social networks in as much social process, and people socialize are taking place, at least in part, on social network sites. Now, the distinction I want to make here is between what I often will call general interest social network sites, which is just the kind of more the broader sites that are very
so popular. Like the Facebook maybe and
Exactly. To make a distinction between those sites and then recovery specific sites, where those are sites that might look and feel and function like Facebook or Instagram, for example, but they cater specifically to individuals that are in recovery or seeking recovery from substance use disorder.
So Brandon, would that be something like in the rooms?
Exactly. That's exactly right. Yeah. So in this paper, we do make that distinction between, and so I wanted to just kind of provide that context between, if I start to say general interest sites or recovery specific sites, that's really what I mean. And there's still so many interesting questions left in terms of like, what's the best way to engage folks in recovery? Is it by kind of separating? Is it kind of like through like a separate closed ecosystem site, like in the rooms? Or is it in the general space of Facebook where people are organically creating these recovery supportive spaces? But okay, so with all that said, the key number from our study is 11%, where of people, and we collected these data in 2017, which is helpful to say. So this is really like the baseline level of kind of like just how are people using online resources to aid their recovery. And the number is 11% of people who have resolved the problem are using these online resources. Again, just to remind folks of that STEM, which is to reduce substance use, quit substance use, or to strengthen their recovery. And so that 11%, because it's nationally representative, it translates to a little bit more than 2 million people, US adults, who have used at some point in their life online resources to aid their recovery. Because in the broader survey, we were able to extrapolate, because it's nationally representative, 22.35 US adults have resolved an alcohol or drug problem. And you could sort of say that 22.35 million US adults are in recovery, although only half identifies being in recovery. So I think the best way to say it is 22.35 million US adults have resolved the problem. Of those, right, about half, so like 11 million, identify as being individuals in recovery. But overall, in this sample, not just of those in recovery, identifies in recovery, but of everybody who's resolved the problem, 11% have used online technology to aid them in their recovery, which translates to about 2 million people. Again, this is back in 2017, without many, really major dissemination efforts, partly because we don't know as much about what's helpful and what's not. So we don't necessarily want to really roll out or scale out something that is of kind of dubious effectiveness, which is where we're at in many ways. But that I think that's the big picture takeaway from the study. And then we could certainly get into some of the finer details as well.
Yeah. I think what's interesting to me is, what happened to the other 90% like individuals. Are they not going to recovery? Like what's happening with those people?
Meaning that the 90% of people that didn't use online technologies?
Yeah.
It's a really good question. I can't answer that with my data. But I mean, what I can say, for example, is like for a part of it is, so one of the things we looked at was factors that predicted, or factors that were kind of correlated, really, in this case, factors that were correlated with use of online technology for recovery. And so one thing we found, for example, right, was that being a young adult, being younger, we actually broke it down in the age categories. So 18 to 29-year-olds, which is somewhat, this is not, it's sort of not that surprising, were more likely than adults 30 and over. Actually, I take that back. It was 18 to 29-year-olds were more likely than adults 45 and over. They weren't different from 30 to 44-year-olds. But so young adults were different from kind of middle-aged and older adults in terms of their use of these online technologies. But, right, this is sort of part of the narrative, is that online technology is kind of more attractive for younger people, and it's not as useful for folks who are older. And so I'm just not sure how true that is, because part of what comes along with being younger in our data set is that they resolved their problem or got into recovery more recently. Right. And so online technology, if somebody got into recovery in the 90s or early 2000s, early to mid 2000s, online technologies were just like not around. Not as much anyways, right? It just wasn't as much part of the zeitgeist. And so, for example, when we control statistically for when somebody got into recovery, when they resolved their problem, that effect of being younger and the greater likelihood of using online technologies goes away. So it's not necessarily that younger folks are like online technologies more in the context of recovery or what have you. At least based on a couple of initial analyses that we did, I think my working hypothesis is that what comes along with being younger is that you've gotten into recovery when more recently, at which point online technologies are more widely available and just much bigger part of the zeitgeist in terms of how people socialize with each other and how they make changes in their lives. So the only other thing to say about that is, you mentioned in the rooms.com, and we did a study, it was a survey of a small sample of folks who were using in the rooms.com. And sort of the methods and how we conducted it is a bit of a larger conversation, but we got the data. We got 125 people. We collected the data real quickly. It was just an open survey, and people signed up real fast. It was during the day. And we ended up getting this sample that the average age was 51 years old. Okay. And then in another survey, for example, that actually it wasn't a survey, in another study of another recovery-specific social network site, the first author was my colleague, Robert Ashford. He and his colleague, Brenda Curtis, and some other folks, they did a study of SoberGrid, of the recovery-specific social network site, SoberGrid. And just as a caveat for any listeners, I personally have because these are companies also. I personally have no financial stake in any of these companies. And they found in that study, they used objective data. So they used analytics that SoberGrid provided to them. They were not necessarily surveying folks, but they were just able to take a look based on the information that the users provided to SoberGrid, and then actually take a look at observed engagement based on the digital footprints that folks left. And there, again, older folks in their study, again, the methods more details about the methods, but older folks there had higher levels of engagement. They were posting more, commenting more on people's posts. So this idea that online technologies as pertaining to recovery are kind of just for younger people is, I think, more a function of just the fact that younger people are more likely to get into recovery more recently, and online technologies have been available more recently. So I think, to answer your question about where's the 90%, I think that comes part and parcel from the fact that there are lots and lots of people in recovery for multiple years, where like 2/3 of our sample had 5 or more years of kind of sort of like continuous recovery. Again, it's not everybody was in abstinence-based recovery. It was a range. It could be some of them were still using. About half of the sample was totally absent from alcohol and other drugs, where the other half were using at least one or more substances. But like 2/3 had 5+ years, something like that. I'm not getting the number exactly right, but it's close. So I think that's partly what's going on with the other 90%. The other thing is important for us to remember too is access to internet access to broadband, especially.
Yeah.
Right. And so it's sort of the technology access divide, or the technological divide, which is narrowing in many ways, but still exists. And anytime we're talking about substance use disorder and recovery, I've learned from my friends who are really interested in these kinds of things, and I've grown to really be thoughtful about this, is the intersectionality of lots of different factors that impact people's access to recovery support services and resources that can be brought, their recovery capital, as it were, resources that can be brought to bear in their recovery. And so in this case, I think one piece of recovery capital might be access to online technology and broadband internet. Now, here's one thing I will say. In our study, okay, we contracted with a company that does these big nationally representative surveys as that's their business model. And in order to get the most nationally representative sample possible, they do surveys through the computer, and so people have to have internet access. So if they recruit somebody for the study, because they obviously want to get people at all the various strata, socioeconomically and geographically and so on, if they don't have a computer with internet access, the company gives it to them. Okay.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
And so where people in our study who were lower socioeconomically may have had access to internet broadband, for example, and they might not otherwise have had that access.
Okay.
Right.
That's good to know.
So one of the things in the study that's really a really interesting phenomenon to me, sort of interesting correlate that's really creates a hypothesis to study for the future that I didn't expect at all. It was totally unexpected. Was that the lowest socioeconomic group, so this was people with household incomes of $30,000 a year or less, they were more likely to have used online technology to aid their recovery relative to folks who had household incomes of $100,000 or more, right? And I like reran that analysis a million times just to make sure I wasn't misinterpreting something, right? Because like if you look at the broader data, 72%, roughly 72, 75, something like that percent of US adults have access to broadband internet. So at least about a quarter of US adults who don't have access to broadband internet, which would really limit the ways in which they can engage with online technologies. And as might be expected, when you look at the whole country, that is divided along socioeconomic lines where folks who have less than a high school degree or lower household incomes, they're the ones who are least likely to have broadband internet access versus folks who have high school, college, and graduate degrees, and folks with in higher socioeconomic strata. So it's sort of it didn't really jive, right, in ways with our findings that if you were lower socioeconomically, you're actually more likely to have used online technology. And so again, I bring all this up to say that in our study, to remember that everybody got this broadband internet access is a function of being in this nationally, part of this nationally representative study. So they had access where they might not have otherwise had access. But what this tells me is that given that everybody had access, people that were lower socioeconomically were more likely to use these online technologies, which kind of points to a need and a sort of like an organic creativity that these folks come to because they might have less access to resources. They might be less likely to have insurance, for example. So they're less likely to be able to, they have less access to kind of professional healthcare services and fewer resources, right? And so they got to get creative. And so what does that mean? Well, what's available is online technologies, many of which are free to the end user. And so they're doing what they can essentially to aid, strengthen, address their recovery needs.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you for that.
Yeah.
So I thought we can move into talking a little bit about what you think the benefits are of using this technology and maybe even some of the challenges, like perhaps any ethical issues that you see.
Yeah. We could do a whole podcast on ethical issues.
I know.
Yeah, probably like a whole podcast series on ethical issues. But yeah, so I think in terms of the effectiveness, the take-home message is we are still learning. And so like if podcast listeners were to ask me, or you were to ask me and say like, what places would you recommend people go, right, that you have some trust in based on what you know kind of empirically? And like at the moment, I would say like, I don't really have, I can't really make those recommendations, right? Because we just don't know much empirically. There are who are really interested in this. Some of us are fortunate to have grant funding. The NIH sees this need. I have funding from the NIAAA, the National Institute on Alcohol Abuse and Alcoholism. They see that there's this need because people are using these online technologies, but we have very little understanding about how helpful they are to people, and then if they're helpful in what ways, so how do they work? So the take home in some ways is we don't know when it comes to at least these freely available online technologies. So let's put a pin in that for a second and to say that there are things that we do know a bit more about empirically. So one platform, for example, they're calling it Connections is what they're calling it, is freely available. I saw this as part of a kind of like an ad or a thing that was going around in the context of COVID-related social distancing, where lots of people have sort of lost access or reduced access to the in-person services that they have come to rely on, right? And so the Addiction Policy Forum, I don't know exactly what they do, but I know that they offer Connections. Connections is a freely available, I believe, a freely available version of what's called HS. HS is an acronym. Don't ask me what it stands for, but the A stands for addiction, the H stands for health, the E stands for enhancement. I forget what the S stands for. But the long and the short of it is, it's a smartphone application that was very rigorously developed and tested by folks. David Gustafson was the principal investigator, and he and his group do really cool work on the use of technology to aid health behavior change. And this, in contrast to a lot of the services that are out there that have sprung up organically, and now folks like myself are interested in understanding in what ways are they helpful, if they are, sort of saying like, okay, people use them, so let's get a sense naturalistically of whether they're helpful, much in the same ways that people were using AA for decades before researchers actually started to get a sense of how helpful they were for folks. So that's really more my domain. But on the sort of flip side, HS was from the get-go developed specifically to be tested in a randomized controlled trial. And so in this case, HS was shown to be efficacious, effective. So I say efficacious because it was tested in a randomized controlled trial. And it was shown it was a paper published in 2014. So we're talking a few years ago at this point. And it was tested in adults with alcohol use disorder. At the time, it was called alcohol dependence, which is in the DSM-5, as you know, and some of your listeners might know, right, doesn't really exist. So it's really severe alcohol use disorder. So people with severe alcohol use disorder, they all went to residential treatment. And then after residential treatment, as they went to one of two programs, and after treatment, they were randomized as part of a continuing care intervention to get either continuing care as usual, which could be sort of outpatient treatment in the community or just whatever it was that they were doing after residential treatment. They were randomized to get that or this HS smartphone application. And this HS app, it provides them with skills. It also provides them with access to this very small like online discussion forum. And one of the kind of more innovative things that HS did was it used geolocation, right? So the GPS technology on our phone, speaking of privacy issues.
Okay.
But where people could say, okay, this place is potentially a trigger for me, right? It could be a bar or a location where somebody used to get high, or their dealer's house, right?
Oh, that's so cool.
Yeah, and they provide a fence, a geo fence around that area. And then if the person was going to come close to it, they got a push notification on their smartphone to say, hey, you're getting close to this area. You may want to avoid it, right? So that was one of the more innovative things. It did lots of different things. It had lots of different cool features anyways. So we do know, for example, that has been shown to be effective in reducing the amount of heavy drinking and increasing the likelihood that somebody was going to stay abstinent after residential treatment up to a year, for example, right? And that app is freely available now. It wasn't always. It was sort of being marketed commercially to treatment programs where they could buy a license to use HS and their patients would get it. But I don't know exactly what led to the transition, but I do know now that app is available. And then just the other thing about kind of effectiveness is there is, again, because you and your listeners may have heard of this, and so I want to mention it, a smartphone application called Reset. Reset's FDA approved, and I can send you information about this too. Reset's FDA approved. It's an FDA approved smartphone application for folks with substance use disorder. And there's a kind of, I don't know what you call it, but like a sister smartphone app, I can't think of a better word, that's specifically for folks with opioid use disorder. So there's sort of for all substance disorders apart from opioid use disorder, there's Reset, and then for folks with opioid use disorder, there's Reset O, right? Yeah. Now it's all very sort of commercial industry, which is really not my personal interest. I'm much more interested in kind of online communities and online community-based resources that are not necessarily being commercialized in ways. I guess I should say I'm more interested in resources that are freely accessible to the public, whereas at least until recently, HS was not, and then Reset is not. Reset is also designed really to be used within clinical programs and to provide where it provides, yes, a technology-based intervention for patients, for individuals themselves, but there's a clinician dashboard where clinicians can see how their patients are doing. And
Interesting.
so, yeah, and so just to, without getting into too much of the detail, this is helpful to kind of, I think, give people context of like how the space works in some ways. So Reset was never actually tested itself. Reset is based, okay, on something called the therapeutic education system, which is a really robust technology-based intervention that itself, okay, itself was based on something called the community reinforcement approach, which is a treatment, a psychosocial treatment that's been around for a very long time. And then there's a version of the community reinforcement approach that's specifically for young people called the adolescent community reinforcement approach, or ACRA, ACRA. I'm a certified ACRA therapist. I got a special training in that. And I mean, the long and the short of it is, we'll take a step back and say, well, like, what is CRA, or what is the community reinforcement approach? And the long and the short of it is, it's based on the idea that in order to compete with the rewards of substances, individuals need to find rewarding activities and experiences in their communities, right? And in their environments. And so that could look so many different ways. For some, right, it could be AA, right? Because at AA, yes, you have meetings, but you have opportunities to meet other people that are
To
in recovery.
engage.
Right, exactly. And when we look at the data on why AA is helpful, going to meetings seems to really be a proxy in many ways, or what's helpful about meetings seems to really be a proxy for this broader social engagement, which is really in many ways what accounts for better outcomes. And so that social engagement could happen anywhere. In fact, there's a treatment called network support, which is Mark Litt is the kind of developer and first author of that treatment. And not to get too much into the weeds or to get too off track, I just bring that up to say that network support uses this sort of community reinforcement approach theory of helping people change up their social lives to support their recovery. And they can use AA, but they don't have to. There's so many different ways people can do that, right? And so to come back to my original point, what community reinforcement approach also did was help people develop skills, communication skills, problem-solving skills, to really be able to navigate their recoveries. And it uses all these modules. It's really, really a very cool treatment that, for me, can really cut across lots of different theories about how people change. But so the therapeutic education system, okay, is based on the community reinforcement approach. It's a web-based version of that, okay? It has been shown to be effectiveness. It has been shown to be effective in clinical trials. And again, just not to get, I don't want to get too much into the weeds, but in terms of what it's been compared to, but let's just say it's an effective web-based intervention. And then here's what happened. A pharmaceutical company at the time called Pear Therapeutics, or they're sort of they're a tech company that contracts with pharmaceutical companies called Pear Therapeutics, they licensed the therapeutic education system and then got FDA approval for that, so that the smartphone applications themselves were never actually tested, but these web-based versions were. And so this is a good example. And now Novartis, okay, the pharmaceutical company, they are responsible now for the oversight of this FDA-approved smartphone app. I think it's a really good example, right?
That's interesting.
Yeah, I think it's a really good example, Reset, of something that's gotten a little bit of press. Like, there's stories covered, and people will ask me about it, but it's not freely available to the public. It's still behind the kind of clinical health system gatekeeper, where health systems need to purchase it for the most part. Again, this might change at some point, right, where it becomes more available to the general public. But at the moment, it's behind the kind of clinical health system gatekeeper, and a clinical program has to buy a license for Reset so that its patients can access that, and it's all in the context of clinical work. So the last thing I'll say is these are things that we know about empirically, where the sites that I'm talking about more and really interested in that people are using that are freely available to the end user, we know far less about those, at least at the moment.
Yeah, that's so interesting that the pharmaceutical company took charge of that.
I mean, yes. I mean, is it surprising to you? I mean,
It's very surprising.
I mean, this is again a larger conversation around.
Right.
This is, I think, part of a larger conversation around access to recovery support services in the United States of America, and how kind of industry in many ways continues to play a large role in terms of what people can and cannot access. And so that's why I'm just so interested in these community-based resources.
Yeah.
And so I think this really speaks to your question of how effective these things are. And I think one thing that I don't see any reason, right? My working hypothesis, I'll say, is that online recovery support meetings specifically probably kind of mobilize some of the same mechanisms of behavior change that in-person meetings do, which is to say that the ways in which in-person, we know a whole lot more about AA, but there's ongoing research on smart recovery too, for example, at our institute, the Recovery Research Institute. And there's no reason, for example, that, what we know that AA and attending AA and active involvement in AA is associated with better outcomes over time in ways that we're pretty sure are they're causally related. Again, this is a larger conversation, but and then when researchers have looked to say like, okay, AA helps promote better outcomes, but how, right? And it does so by these social changes I was mentioning before, by helping people change up their social networks, increase their social support, increasing their confidence.
Yeah.
To increase their confidence to handle risky social situations or other kinds of risky situations, increase their confidence to handle unpleasant feelings and stressful experiences, right? So what people sometimes call kind of recovery self-efficacy, it does so by increasing their motivation, right? By sort of increasing, they get folks that get involved in different kinds of recovery supportive spaces. They see other people in recovery. And so that can be motivating for them. And it enhances their positive expectancies about recovery. And then coping skills, right? So it sort of gives people all sorts of new ways to cope with the things that, sort of all new recovery coping strategies, right? And so that's how AA works. And for me, I don't theoretically, I think online recovery support meetings can mobilize a lot of those same mechanisms, perhaps to a lesser extent when it comes to these social network changes, which is one of the things I'm interested in online communities where people can kind of get in these larger conversations. And so, I mean, one of the things that I'm interested in kind of looking at empirically is, especially with this mass migration now to online recovery support meetings in light of COVID social distancing recommendations, I want to get a sense of, I'm in the process of designing a study, again, IRB approval, sort of and recommended tweaks pending, where I'm going to be facilitating people's involvement in online recovery support meetings that are newer to the recovery process, and then seeing how they participate and whether it's associated with better outcomes. Here, it's not going to be a randomized controlled trial. It's a pilot study just to get a sense of how people participate. But I'm really eager to learn, especially about the process of this stuff. And I'm interested, for example, in what ways are online recovery support services similar to in-person services? How are they kind of mobilizing the same sorts of mechanisms? And then maybe how are they mobilizing mechanisms in sort of different ways? So what makes online services different? One is access, right?
Right.
In our study, in the survey of In the Rooms that I mentioned a little bit ago, we asked people in an open-ended way just to say what they found most helpful about In the Rooms and then what they found most challenging. But in terms of what they found most helpful, one of the most common responses was just the accessibility and convenience, right? So, and I think in the context of COVID social distancing, that's an obvious way in which access to these online services affords people the opportunity for recovery involvement that they wouldn't have otherwise. But that phenomenon, is still relevant even when COVID is no longer a crisis. There people have trouble accessing services for so many reasons. They're in rural areas or have childcare responsibilities or have a job that makes it hard to attend meetings. And so it's accessibility. And the other interesting thing that makes online services different is that people could be completely anonymous if they want to. And so I am interested in the ways in which that might affect how people participate and how they experience recovery support services as well.
Yeah.
So I think there are probably other things too, but those are two right off the top of my head.
And I'm also wondering, so I do a lot of groups. I'm a groupie, and I've had to take all of my therapeutic groups online. And I don't seem to have an issue with getting people to participate because I just call them out. But for the people that maybe aren't good at leading online groups or, don't know how to engage individuals, what can the individuals do to make sure that they're getting the most out of these online formats during COVID-19?
Well, one of the things that we know from in-person studies is that more active involvement is a much better indicator of how people are going to do over time rather than kind of just attendance, yes or no. And so I think the extent to which people are willing if they're willing to share during a meeting, I suspect that that would give them an opportunity to sort of get something out and then potentially allow the power of shared experience and universality. That is one of the reasons we know, speaking of groups, is, in Yalom's sort of group therapy curative factors, we think can be applicable in mutual help settings too. And so the extent to which people are willing to share, because it might be helpful, because then people that share after them who can sort of end up relating to them, people can sort of get that shared experience and realize, oh, I'm not alone, which kind of reduces any kind of negative feelings they might have about the experiences that they're having. And then I think that's one. And then the other is less so in context of online recovery support, but we know that just in general, coping skills, increased coping skills can be helpful. And one of the ways that these online resources can be helpful in terms of coping skills is social support. Social support is just a major coping skill for folks. And so the extent to which people find online resources helpful as a source of social support, particularly during COVID and social distancing, to use social support, the increased access to social support, to reach out and to get some really mentoring from people who are a little bit more experienced with recovery, and perhaps they might learn something new or get a new understanding of something that they're experiencing. And so I think that that's one of two ways. Now, again, I'm not sure that people wouldn't benefit also from just attending and listening to these online recovery support meetings. They might, but I think if people are really looking to leverage what's out there in terms of online resources, I would sort of suggest they try, without really knowing necessarily whether it's going to be helpful or not, to be honest, but try to get a little bit more actively involved and see how that works for them. And that kind of advice is based on what we know about in-person service.
Okay. So more active involvement may look like, sharing maybe what you're struggling with, or asking for help, or
I think sharing, asking for help. And then, although we wouldn't necessarily measure or think about it this way in research, but just as a sort of clinician and, just thinking broadly about human beings, I think if people listen with intent, right? I think there's probably benefit to if somebody's saying, oh, I'm struggling with loneliness or social isolation during this time. Yeah. And I'm not willing to share necessarily because that's not where I'm at emotionally. I'm not willing to kind of open up to people I don't know necessarily, which I think is, I understand. But to listen with intent around what other people are sharing around how they're dealing with isolation, and sort of making a very specific, intentional set of mental notes of, oh, this is how folks who are experienced in recovery, this is how they are coping with social isolation. Let me jot down a few of these things and give them a try in my life and see if they're helpful.
Yes. Okay. Well, that was great. A lot of amazing tips for the listeners. So, Brandon, how can people best find you and some of the awesome work that you're putting out there in the community?
Thanks. So there's two ways. One, so broadly speaking, this is not just for me. So the Recovery Research Institute, which is the name of our research program, but it's also this public health initiative that we have. We have a monthly newsletter. It's completely free. And we take the research in general on treatment and recovery support, what we know empirically. And we take these scientific articles that are typically only available to people that have access. One of the bigger frustrations for me is that all this stuff is behind a paywall and you have to be associated with a hospital or university to get access to it unless you want to pay for it.
Right.
So we take the science and we summarize it in ways that we hope are more engaging for lots of different stakeholders, including clinicians and the general public. And every month we put out a newsletter that has, give or take, 8 summaries on some of the latest science on treatment and recovery. And it has summaries, and we also have like an addiction policy update. And then this newsletter links to our website, recoveryanswers.org. Again, it's all freely available. It's a big, major public health initiative. And so people, in terms of like generally ways that they can learn more about the latest research on treatment and recovery from substance disorder, broadly speaking, they could do that. They could sign up for our free newsletter by going to recoveryanswers.org, and then the space to sign up for newsletters right there. And then there's just all sorts of resources on there. And then for me personally, you just, at the moment, anytime I have new research coming out or research that my colleagues are doing that I think is really interesting, I post about it and chat about it on Twitter. You can follow me on Twitter. It's my handle is @BrandonB.PhD, @BRANDON B, which is the first letter of my last name, PhD. That's my handle, @BrandonB.PhD. You can follow me there. And I love talking research, and especially talking about how research applies to people's day-to-day lives. So yeah, definitely follow me there. and check out recoveryanswers.org.
Yes. Yep. I just got my newsletter today, actually.
Ah, cool. Very cool. Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you again so much for being on.
You're welcome. It was a pleasure. I'll come anytime you'll have me. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Brandon. Thank you for listening to the Atheists in Recovery podcast. For more great info and to stay up to date, head over to atheistsandrecovery.com.